So you've probably heard talk over the years about the hydrogen economy, and there are some real trials and tribulations regarding the use of hydrogen, and I'm going to go through some of those. But before I get into it, I want to say that I'm dedicating this talk to Dr. Frank CRES. He passed away back in 2018. He's the guy that hired me at the Solar Energy Research Institute, which was the predecessor of NREL. He had been a CU professor. He was a solar pioneer. He left to work at CRES, ultimately went back to do teaching at CU, but a really prolific author of textbooks and also taught a lot of graduate student courses. The reason I'm dedicating this to him is because you'll see his name appear again when I talk about some of the issues associated with hydrogen. All right, so what I'm going to do, these are the things I'm going to cover. I'm going to give a little bit of background of where we are, particularly in this country, on hydrogen. Talk a little bit about the properties of the molecule so you know kind of what the good things and bad things are about it. And then how hydrogen can be utilized for these various uses: transportation, buildings, industry. Also, recently, NREL's done some studies saying that hydrogen could play a role in electricity storage. And at the end, I'll try to pull it together. So, background. So, back in his State of the Union address in 2003, President George W. Bush announced in his address, "Tonight, I'm proposing $1.2 billion in research funding so that America can lead the world in developing clean hydrogen-powered automobiles, so that the first car driven by a child born today," that would be someone born in 2003, "could be powered by hydrogen." And so a lot of work since, the Department of Energy has a whole program office dedicated to hydrogen fuel cell cars. NREL's done a lot of work. I think NREL has maybe 2 Toyota Mirais. Now, you might think, you've probably seen in the press lately, certain people raising questions about, well, gee, how much money do you want to put in hydrogen? Does it make sense? And I just want to point out, this is not a new concern. So this is actually a paper that Frank CRES and Ron West wrote. Ron West was a chemical engineering professor at CU. And the two of them wrote this paper, "The Fallacies of a Hydrogen Economy." And I'm going to pull out a couple quotes here. "Electric vehicles using batteries to store electricity are shown to be more efficient and less polluting than fuel cell powered vehicles using energy stored in hydrogen." So I'm going to cover hydrogen cars. I'm also going to cover the use of hydrogen in buildings. And here's what they said about that. To use hydrogen made by electrolysis to produce heat is inefficient and wasteful. So what I'm saying is, right at the time that Bush announced this hydrogen initiative, there were people questioning whether that is something we wanted to put a lot of dollars into. At the same time, in March 3rd of 2004, the former Acting Assistant Secretary of Energy, Joe Rome, gave testimony to the House Science Committee, and here's what he said. "Probably the biggest analytical mistake made in most hydrogen studies, including the recent National Academy report, is failing to consider whether the fuels might be used to make hydrogen, such as natural gas or renewables, could be better used simply to make electricity." And he came out with a book called The Hype About Hydrogen that got lots of press. A lot of people were interested in that book at that time. I think he's coming out with a new edition of it soon. What year was that? 2004. That same year he came out with that book. Okay, so now fast forward to today, 20 years later, 19 years later, whatever. To rein in climate change, Biden pledges $7 billion to regional hydrogen hubs. And when this was announced, I can tell you at CU and every other place, it was, oh, we got to put in proposals. Hydrogen hubs. We're going to work on hydrogen hubs. We're going to get some research dollars. So this is a quick summary. Look, my presentation is going to be really on the engineering aspects, the energy aspects of hydrogen. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the financial aspects, but I thought I owed you this slide. So this gives a summary of what the government support in the U.S. is for hydrogen today. So there's the hydrogen hubs. There's 7 of them. 3 of them have been funded to date, but only a small amount of seed funding. I think like $40 million each to those 3. But the pledge is $7 billion, but that is to spur $40 billion of private investment. That's the idea. That's supposed to be seed money. Private investment is supposed to pour in. And if you look at this IRA Section 45V, basically it says you can get up to $3 a kilogram a tax credit if you meet a lot of criteria. And those criteria are the 3 bullets that I list there. You have to meet the condition called additionality. That means you have to show that there's renewable energy generation that's less than 3 years old that's going to be available specifically to provide energy for electrolyzers. Temporal matching, and even on an hour-by-hour basis at some point, they're going to require that when you're running an electrolyzer using this electricity, that on an hour-by-hour basis, it has to be renewable electricity. And finally, deliverability. The renewable energy generation has to be in the same location as the hydrogen production. Okay, so 1 year in, this is a recent headline. This is from October 16th, right? So this is within the last week. 1 year in, U.S. clean hydrogen hubs face questions and have few answers. There was a lot of talk about Andrew Forrest, who's the head of the large billionaire, head of the large Australian mining company, Fortescue, and all sorts of talk about him starting all these hydrogen projects around the world, including in the U.S. And these are recent headlines. Fortescue hits brakes on green hydrogen plans. Prince George, British Columbia, hydrogen project plans put on hold. All right, so that's kind of a quick look at the politics 20 years ago and what's going on today. The government is, again, trying to support the development of a hydrogen economy, but lots of questions about that, not going quite the way they planned. All right, so a quick overview of hydrogen. I'm sorry to give you lots of numbers, but I thought I'd get them over with quickly in this slide. The first 3 rows here are basically physical properties of hydrogen, and the last 3 have to do with how it works when it's being combusted as a flame. So hydrogen has a very high energy per unit mass, 3 times that of gasoline. And if you look at the little thing on the bottom there, 1 kilogram of hydrogen has the same energy content as a gallon of gasoline, roughly. Energy per unit volume. It's about 1/3 natural gas. This is the real problem with hydrogen. It has a very low volumetric density. You'll see that when we start looking at aviation applications in particular, but it applies to cars as well. If it's in liquid form, if you get it cold enough and it's a cryogenic liquid and you store it, instead of storing it at 10,000 psi in a pressure vessel as a gas, now you're storing it as a cold liquid, and basically you have it in a vacuum bottle. In that case, the energy content is about 1/4 that of jet fuel. And again, we'll come back to that when I get to aviation. And then when you look at the combustion characteristics, it has a flame velocity that's 8 times that of methane, which is the fundamental component of natural gas. It has an ignition range 6 times wider than methane. So anything between a 4% and a 70% mixture of hydrogen air can ignite. And it also has a 1/10 the ignition energy of methane. Now, when people talk about hydrogen, they use different colors. And I think, I heard Martin was going to mention at the beginning that we're going to try to hold questions until the end, okay? So unless you have something that, you really don't understand a word I'm using or something, I'd appreciate waiting until the end, and then I'll try to answer all your questions. So the way, if you want to look at the different ways you can produce hydrogen, they use different colors to describe that. I'm not going to describe all these. I'm going to pick out 3 that are important. Green hydrogen, that's really the one that the IRA tax incentive applies to. To really meet that $3 per kilogram tax credit, you got to have green hydrogen. And what that means is hydrogen from electrolysis, where you're running electricity through water, splitting into hydrogen and oxygen. And I'll get to another area where it's sometimes called green hydrogen. But generally, when people say green hydrogen, they mean renewable energy is being used to split water into hydrogen and oxygen. Okay? And then if you go down that list, gray hydrogen, that's from natural gas reforming. It's called steam reformation of natural gas. It's the way in the US most of the natural gas is created. Big carbon dioxide emitter. I'll cover that in more detail. And finally, blue hydrogen, that's where you say, okay, we're going to use steam reforming of natural gas, but instead of putting that CO2 in the atmosphere, we're going to capture it and we're going to geologically sequester it. All right, so those are the three colors that I think of most interest: green, gray, and blue. So if you look at hydrogen production in the world today and the uses today, the bar chart on the left shows how it's produced, and the bar chart on the right shows how it's used. And so if you look here on the world basis, you can see that light brown is basically SMR, or steam methane reformation of natural gas. SMR confuses people because it's also used for small modular reactors. But when you hear SMR here, it's steam methane reforming. It's 71% of world hydrogen is produced that way, and the vast majority in the US is produced that way. You can also produce it from gasification of coal, 24.7%, and there's some other minor ways to produce it, actually. Not really much in the way of green hydrogen in the world today at all. And if you look at how it's used, that big purple one there is in refineries. So as we get off a fossil fuel energy economy, a lot of that's going to go away. Not all of it. There's some things that we need to use that require some use of fossil fuels, but as an energy source, that part's going to go away. The 31 megatons there, the red, that's ammonia production basically for fertilizer. All right, so those are the major uses. And then I have at the bottom there, 10 million tons of hydrogen are produced in the US annually for refineries and fertilizer production. Almost all of that is from natural gas steam reforming. All right, so here's a place where steam methane reforming goes on. I threw in a couple equations here. Basically, you know, I know we have people in CRES that are into chemistry, so don't worry about these. But I put them in there so when people get the slides, they'll have these equations at hand. And also maybe I can trick you into thinking I remember some of my chemistry. But anyway, that's why they're there. All right, so CO2 emissions from hydrogen production. So this is what we're really trying to do. We got, you know, a lot of people say, oh, we're going to go to a hydrogen economy. There's a group of engineers and scientists out there who say, wait a minute, hydrogen is not a climate change solution. It's a climate change problem. We produce all this hydrogen from steam methane reforming of natural gas, and we put all that CO2 in the atmosphere. So don't come to me saying you got the solution to climate change. You give me a problem. We got to address that problem. And I'll talk about, it gets into priorities about what we do with hydrogen. I'll cover that later. So look, if you use coal gasification, which not much of that is done in the US, but in the rest of the world, a significant amount, 18 to 20 kilograms of CO2 get emitted per kilogram of hydrogen. Steam methane reforming, that's the gray hydrogen, 8 to 12. And then electrolysis, well, it depends. It depends on how clean the electricity is, but if you want to say it's green hydrogen, then it's got to be electrolysis from wind or solar energy. Now, what about blue hydrogen? So a lot of the industry basically is saying, well, look, you know, we'll give you gray hydrogen today. We'd love to give you green hydrogen, but it's really expensive. We'll give you gray hydrogen, but don't worry. We're going to transition that to blue hydrogen. And that again, is capturing and sequestering the CO2. So this one paper by Bob Howarth of Cornell and Mark Jacobson of Stanford looked at this and basically found what's in the bottom line here, and this was at a fairly low value of assumed upstream fugitive methane emissions of 1.5%. The number in Colorado, for example, is about I always forget if it's 2.3 or 2.4% is sort of the general percent of natural gas that gets consumed that actually winds up being lost. So even at a value of 1.5% leakage here, they say greenhouse gas emissions for blue hydrogen are still greater than from simply burning natural gas, and are only 18 to 25% less than for gray hydrogen. Bottom line, their paper at least says blue hydrogen does not buy you very much. This is a paper written by a couple folks, one of whom, Paul Martin, is very active in the hydrogen space. He's a Canadian chemical engineer. Hydrogen is big oil's last grand scam. And so what a lot of people feel, looking at all the lobbying that goes into the idea of a hydrogen economy, is that, look, the fossil fuel industry is used to producing fuels. They already produce natural gas by fracking. Wouldn't it be great if they could take that natural gas and say, okay, don't worry, we'll stop turning it directly into hydrogen. We'll capture the CO2 and sequester it. We'll produce blue hydrogen. And they know that green hydrogen is very expensive. So the argument is, look, they really want to continue producing fuels, and that's going to mean gray and blue hydrogen. All right, now I'm going to get into how to use the hydrogen in these different sectors. All right, let's talk about cars. So the first thing, look, when we talk about cars, what we're talking about is green hydrogen produced by electrolysis, and then that green hydrogen gets fed at a hydrogen refueling station into a hydrogen vehicle, and that hydrogen goes into a fuel cell and gets converted back to electricity. So look, there are different types of electrolyzers. I'm showing you one type here. If you were doing a big plant of electrolyzers, you might use alkaline electrolyzers or other types. I'll explain in a minute why I'm showing you the proton exchange membrane electrolysis. It's actually the most common one that people will see. But essentially, look, what you're doing here, and again, I have the reaction at the bottom there, it's pretty simple. You're passing electricity through water. You have a membrane that allows protons to go through. What's a proton? It's the nucleus of a hydrogen atom, right? It's just got one proton. Those protons move through the membrane, and electrons go the other way, and you wind up generating an electric current. And we've actually done this in the laboratory. We actually did some flow visualization once in a laboratory. We had a heat exchanger, and we mimicked the flow in water, and we put in an electrode and did electrolysis right there, produced hydrogen and oxygen bubbles, and we used them for flow visualization. And then this is a PEM fuel cell, and basically you could take the electrolyzer and essentially run it backwards as a fuel cell, and that's what goes on here. So you put in the hydrogen, the oxygen. I guess this is going to work on that screen. The oxygen just comes from the air, and what gets exhausted is water vapor and heat. So you can actually use a fuel cell for heating also, in addition to running an electric motor. And again, the equations are listed there. All right, so here's the problem of fuel cell vehicles. This is something that was produced by Volkswagen. But what you can see here is on the top, you have a battery electric vehicle. On the bottom in this diagram, you have a fuel cell vehicle. In both cases, you're starting with renewable electricity. In this case, we're starting with the same amount, and we look at how much ultimately gets to the wheels of the vehicle. How much of that electricity we start with gets to the wheels. Now, the fundamental issue with hydrogen, it's not an energy source. It's strongly bound to oxygen and water. You have to put in energy to get the hydrogen out. So it's an energy carrier. Now, some people say, well, electricity is an energy carrier. In some ways, hydrogen is a worse energy carrier because it's a secondary energy carrier. You've got to take one energy carrier, electricity, and then use that to produce the secondary energy carrier, hydrogen. And that takes energy. So I put in some numbers on this graph here. You can see, for example, electrolysis, I've got it 70% efficiency. Compression and liquefaction, you can either distribute it to a refueling station as a gas or as a liquid. Transportation and storage, etc. Basically, all you have on the electric vehicle, battery electric vehicle side is, I got 95%. I think maybe the average is about that in terms of how much you lose in the grid. And then you put that into a battery, and then ultimately you need you basically need a converter to run an AC motor. And down here, but when hydrogen, you go through all these various steps. So there are these cascades of inefficiency. So the bottom line here is you can see, ultimately on the top, for the battery electric vehicle, 70 to 90% of that original electricity that you generated from solar and wind winds up getting to the wheels of the vehicle. In the case of the fuel cell vehicle, only 25 to 35%. So essentially, it takes 3 times as much electricity to power a hydrogen vehicle than it does a battery electric vehicle. That's why if you go out in the parking lot, you're probably going to see battery electric vehicles. You're probably not going to see hydrogen fuel cell vehicles. That's the fundamental reason. There are other reasons too, of course. We have a national grid to distribute electricity, no such grid to distribute hydrogen. Here's another thing, and this is a study that just came out. This is a paper that just came out in a preprint. It's actually, the official date is December 18th of this year, but it just came out as a preprint. And this study from Harvard said storage and distribution costs may limit green hydrogen's economic viability. Currently costs $7 to $15 per kilogram, and carbon abatement costs are between $500 and $1,250 per ton, per metric ton, every 1,000 kilograms of CO2. Now, the latest EPA number, which is higher than what the government has been using, is a social cost of carbon $190 per ton. So this is somewhere between 2.5 times that and 6 times that. So not a cheap way to abate carbon emissions. And you look at this thing here. They say, oh, $7 to $15 per kilogram. Take a look at, if you own a Toyota Mirai, and the only place you can really charge it up with hydrogen is in California, and you go to a hydrogen refueling station, and you're lucky enough that they have hydrogen. This is an actual shot of how much you're paying. Okay, $36 a kilogram. Really, really expensive. And again, it's not just the production cost, it's all these other associated costs. So I own a Hyundai Ioniq 5, and I thought, okay, let me compare that to a Toyota Mirai. And basically, you look at the range and the cost of hydrogen, and at the bottom, you look at the cost of electricity. And this is if you're refueling both in the LA area, okay? You're paying 58 cents a mile for the Toyota Mirai. You're paying 8 cents a mile for the Hyundai Ioniq 5. And for that, I used 28 cents a kilowatt hour, which is the current price in LA. I pay about half of that at my home. So it's actually a lot worse than this, but I felt I should use the same numbers for LA. Here's the other thing. If you look at a competition between fuel cell vehicles and battery electric vehicles aren't standing still. There are constant improvements in battery technology. And you can see from this graph, which is a new one that just came out recently from Goldman Sachs, you can see where we are at 2004, and they're projecting continuing decline of battery costs. Here's another question to ask. Okay, it's expensive. How green is it, though? Well, it turns out when you go to a hydrogen refueling station in California, 2/3 of it is gray hydrogen from steam methane reformation and natural gas. 1/3 is from biomass. They call it green. It's not from electrolysis. It's basically from biogas, for example, from landfills. And that qualifies in California. They have to have at least 1/3 from supposedly a green source. But here's what one report says about the biomass portion. Energy is required for harvesting, gathering, transporting, storage, and conversion of feedstocks. If biomass feedstocks are not carefully selected and energy consumed during processing is not closely monitored and controlled, the carbon footprint can exceed that of fossil, namely gray hydrogen. So 2/3 of it is gray, and 1/3 of it, hopefully, is better than gray, but not necessarily. And I note here in California, because we're comparing a fuel cell vehicle to an electric vehicle, in California right now, on average, their grid is 54% of their electricity is carbon-free. Recent headline, Shell closes its hydrogen stations in California. And as it turns out, this is happening around the world. Hydrogen stations are closing in Europe as well. Toyota's hydrogen future is crumbling as owners file lawsuits call for buybacks. Toyota is now selling the Toyota Mirai at a 60% discount. So if you want one, you can get it real cheap, but you can't really drive it, right? Well, you can move to LA and hope and be willing to pay those high costs, I guess. All right, so look, the people who have been promoting fuel cell cars, finally a couple years ago, they started saying, all right, okay, yeah, we get it. We look out there, everybody's buying battery electric vehicles. People aren't buying fuel cell vehicles. But you know what? For trucks, you're going to need hydrogen for trucks because you're going to need just these really big batteries for trucks. And so you're going to have to go to hydrogen. And buses too. Well, no sooner were they making that argument than a researcher from the Fraunhofer Institute published a paper saying hydrogen is unlikely to play a major role in road transport, even for heavy trucks. And that was a paper in January of 2022, so a little over 2 years ago. All right, let's do a comparison. On the top, we have a battery electric truck. On the bottom, we have a fuel cell truck. This is done by Traton, a big trucking outfit in the European Union. And in this particular cascade of efficiencies, they're saying that you start with renewable electricity on the left from wind or solar. 75% of that electricity gets to the wheels of the truck in the case of battery electric trucks, 25% in the case of fuel cell trucks. It's really pretty much the same argument. So there's an EV group in Canada, and they gave a presentation and did an analysis where they compared the Nikola TRE, which is a fuel cell truck, to the Tesla Semi. And basically they said when you compare the actual weights of these semis, in fact, the Nikola weighs more than the Tesla does. In fact, where you see the check marks, they said Tesla has a better range, it's lower in weight, it has a lower price, and it has a lower cost per 100 kilometers. So, I taught a sustainable energy course up at CU a couple of years ago, and I had my students analyze the Tesla Semi, and one of the questions, we had to use some assumptions at the time because Musk was being pretty close to the vest about the data. But at that time, I think we came up with EV trucks get a little bit of a break. Electric trucks get an extra 2,000 miles, 2,000 pounds of cargo capacity. So the total weight, they're allowed to get up to 82,000 instead of 80,000. But anyway, we looked at, okay, if you compare to a diesel truck, basically the Tesla we concluded, and you can find different numbers out there now, that the Tesla would be able to carry about 12% less weight. Now, that's if you're carrying concrete pallets and you fill the truck. That becomes an issue. Most trucks are going around not fully loaded. In a lot of cases, they're volume limited, not weight limited. So it's not really that critical, that 12%. Well, you got to charge these trucks. And right now, the fastest charging stations out there for electric vehicles are the Electrify America stations. Those are the ones that Volkswagen had to build because they cheated on diesel vehicles. Remember that? But the Electrify America stations, when they're working, they can provide 350 kilowatts. But now there are 3 megawatt charging stations being built, specifically for trucks. And I was kind of curious. I was thinking, okay, if you're driving a Tesla Semi and you go to one of these 3 megawatt charging stations, the Tesla Semi has an 850 kilowatt hour battery, and you go to a 3 megawatt station, you can't run at 3 megawatts the whole time. You have to taper it off, particularly as you get closer to the end. I was conservative. I said, okay, let's say on average, it can only provide 1.5 megawatts. So basically that 850 kilowatt battery will charge from 10% to 80%, which is typical range. You don't want to drive an EV down below 10%. You might run out of electricity. And if you try to charge it over 80%, your charge rate gets really slow. So that 10 to 80% is pretty typical. That gives you a 350-mile range, and the truck driver would have to wait 24 minutes for that. I think that's pretty reasonable. I don't know about you guys. Battery electric fuel cell buses. New study found running costs are 2.3 times higher than battery electric buses. One of the first French cities that started buying hydrogen fuel cell buses dropped their order for 51 hydrogen buses after realizing electric ones are 6 times cheaper to run. you kind of wonder, I mean, doesn't anybody do due diligence before they invest money? I don't get it. Anyway. All right, so you have Cummins and other companies saying, okay, well, we can burn hydrogen in our engines. Big truck makers bet on hydrogen to extend combustion engine life. We know how to make combustion engines. Fine, we'll figure out a way to put hydrogen in them and burn hydrogen. Here's the problem. This was a paper published this year. These are different driving cycles, okay? But basically, on the left, you see the internal combustion engine vehicle, and on the right, you see the fuel cell vehicle, and this is the efficiency. Basically, you get another 50% hit in efficiency if you go from the fuel cell now to an internal combustion engine. And on top of that, you know, one of the nice things about fuel cells, right, is the only thing that comes out of your tailpipe is water vapor. Not so if you're running in a combustion engine. Hydrogen generally burns at a higher temperature than natural gas, and you can get even more nitrogen oxide and nitrogen dioxide, or NOx emissions. What about trains? Upper left there is a railway authority in Romania canceled its purchase of 12 hydrogen-powered electric trains. Upper right is Germany quitting the hydrogen train business. Netherlands at the bottom cancels tender to supply hydrogen trains. All right, what about airplanes? Well, Airbus has been working a while on saying, okay, you know, we're gonna switch to hydrogen. We're gonna power our planes with hydrogen. Big problem there is that fact when you compare it to kerosene or jet fuel, the per volume density of hydrogen, and we're talking now liquid hydrogen, all right? You're not going to try to put pressurized tanks in the planes. You're going to put in these cryogenic bottles of liquid hydrogen that you got to keep cold, and you're going to get some boil off. There's always going to be vapor being released from this. But in any case, you have to fill almost the whole passenger compartment with these things. For a while, Airbus was publishing, you know, where the airplane is just one big wing, because, you know, where's jet fuel stored? It's stored in the wings of the planes. Well, you got to make some, the plane has to become big, thick wings, right? They finally realized, yeah, I don't think we're going to do that. And so now they have a concept where they're reducing the number of passengers that can fit in the plane. I really think there are so many issues with this. Again, you'll see in a moment, hydrogen is incredibly leaky. And very combustible. Having it on a passenger plane, not a great idea. And when you think about the airline industry and you think about how safe it is, you ever see that map that shows how many planes are in the air at any one time? The accident rate is astonishingly low. They've spent all these decades learning how to use jet fuel. To think that they're going to change to hydrogen and all those safety issues, hard to believe. But anyway, they're going down that route. Okay, so what can you do? It's really come down to a competition between two things. Electrofuels or e-fuels and biofuels. So what are electrofuels? Electrofuels are, okay, you're gonna use electricity, you're gonna produce green hydrogen with electrolysis, and you're gonna mix that with other things to perform these fuels, preferably drop-in fuels. And the last one that I added to the list there is kerosene, that's jet fuel. So that's the e-fuel route. And then you can look at biofuels where you're doing the same thing. You're coming up with these fuels by starting with biomass and using various types of processes. Well, here's the problem with e-fuels. Here's another one of these cascading efficiency diagrams. On the left, now this was done for passenger cars, but it's the same kind of thing if you look at it for planes, because we're really just comparing the fuel sources here. But you got electric direct electricity on the left. In the middle, you got hydrogen and fuel cells, and then at the end, you have electrofuels. And the problem is really expensive and really inefficient. A lot of steps you're going through there. Still being pursued, though. If you look at what's currently being used by a few airlines, and we're talking the tiniest percent of jet fuels going this way, and these are just mixed into the jet fuel, in some case at a very small percentage. But these are the different paths to biojet fuel. And the one at the bottom that I put yellow on is hydrotreated esters and fatty acids. A long name, it's called, I don't know if they pronounce it HEFA or HEFA. I've been saying HEFA. But it's basically, that process is being used right now where they mix a small amount of this particular biofuel. And they start with an oilseed crop or algae, although I think that they've been discouraged by the cost of trying to do this with algae. And that's a little diagram of what the HEFA process looks like. Oils and fats, hydrotreated. And even there, though, notice what's coming in from the right there is hydrogen. So you're even when you're using biofuels, you're still looking for some green hydrogen to put in there. So this is a real interesting report that was done by NREL in July of this year, and I found it interesting. It says sourcing hydrogen is a major challenge for HEFA SAF facilities. So SAF is Sustainable Aviation Fuels. It's a generic term for these not really low carbon, but carbon neutral fuels, right? Of course, when you go with biofuels, the idea is you're taking, when the biomass grows, it takes carbon out of the atmosphere, and then ultimately when you burn it, you put the carbon back in, you say it's carbon neutral. You got to move that you got to do a lot of things that involve some emissions, so it's not really quite carbon neutral. And also you're changing the time scale. Let's say you're going to say, I'm going to take waste crops, and instead of letting them decompose in the field, I'm going to turn them into a biofuel, and I'm going to burn them in a jet engine. Well, this is carbon dioxide that might have taken decades to get into the atmosphere, and now you're putting it instantly. So you're also changing the time scale. The other thing they said is the HEFA SAF industry is severely feedstock constrained. So there are a lot of people that are against e-fuels that think that they're just too expensive, too inefficient. They say, we're going to use biofuels. There are some real issues with biofuels, too. What about shipping? Well, we have something that works to our advantage here. In shipping, about 40% of all cargo that goes transoceanic is oil, coal, and gas. So look, if we get to a renewable energy economy, get away from these things, instantly we start dropping the cost, the emissions associated with shipping. I have to ship that stuff. So that's one good thing. What are shipping options? I should have pointed out when I showed you that little HEFA diagram how it's formed. It can not only form jet fuel, it can also be used to form biodiesel, the same process. So you can use the same process you use for jet fuel to produce biodiesel for shipping. You can also produce biomethanol, and there's a little chart there that shows how to produce biomethanol, but guess what? It's also showing some green hydrogen coming in there. So even there's some use of green hydrogen. Now I spoke to one hydrogen expert. He says, yeah, but you don't necessarily have to do that. You could do it all with the biomass. Maybe, but all the diagrams I see generally show that, so I presume they've decided that there's some advantage to doing that. But, green hydrogen's expensive, and so maybe his point is you don't have to go to that expense. China launches the world's largest electric container ship with 50 megawatt-hour batteries. So look, certainly for ships, ferries and that sort of thing, short distances, battery electrics is being used for shipping. And I should have mentioned people are working on short hop planes that use battery electrics in the plane. To my way of thinking, because they say it's really hard to do that on long flights, but on short flights you can get enough battery on a plane. To me, it would make much more sense to do high-speed electric rail and do that between cities instead of, and I don't have it in this presentation, but I have some maps that show where high-speed electric rail could really make sense in the U.S. We have virtually none. And if you go to China, or you go to Spain, or you go to Italy, or you go to France, they have all sorts of high-speed electric rail lines. We're really behind everybody else on that. Anyway, so you can do battery electric ships too. You can imagine, look at these ships that have all these shipping containers, right? Imagine if you have a bunch of containers just full of batteries, okay? You're going to reduce your cargo capacity. The general feeling is now, probably can't use batteries for transoceanic yet. They're not at the stage where we can use that. But you can use biomethanol or biodiesel. And I think, is it Maersk, one of the big shipping outfits, they're really going with methanol now. That's what they're promising. Okay, in the building space, here's another one of these diagrams. So people have proposed, okay, we're going to produce green hydrogen, and we're going to pump that into houses, and we're going to burn it in a furnace and heat your house that way. This is a similar diagram. This is done by a professor at the University of Cambridge. A little bit different because instead of starting with the same amount of renewable electricity and seeing how much winds up as heating in your house, he does the opposite. He says, let's assume you're putting 70 gigawatts of domestic heating into homes. How many gigawatts of renewable electricity do you need to do that? So to do the same amount of heating with hydrogen as using heat pumps, you're basically using on the order of 5 times as much, 150 gigawatts or 6 times as much, 150 to 26. And the reason this is even a bigger discrepancy than we saw for comparing fuel cell vehicles to battery electric vehicles is we have heat pumps. Heat pumps are these magical devices, right? You put in, if I look at my heat pump at home, its average coefficient of performance over the heating season is about 2.5. Every kilowatt hour of electricity I put into that heat pump, I get 2.5 kilowatts of heat in my house. So there's just no comparison between heating a house with a heat pump versus heating it with hydrogen. And in fact, this one meta-review done by Jan Rosenau found a total of 54 independent studies now say there will be no significant role for hydrogen in heating. And what really drove this is, particularly in the United Kingdom, the gas industry has really been pushing the idea of we're going to replace gas boilers with hydrogen boilers. Now, none of the gas utilities are happy about heat pumps. And we have in Colorado Excel, which is both an electric utility and a gas utility. So they came out with a clean heat plan about a year ago, year and a half ago now, I guess, maybe. And let me think, where are we? Yeah, a year and a few months ago. They came out with a clean heat plan to talk about how they were going to decarbonize building heating in Colorado. Well, there are all different colors of natural gas in that plan. I'm not going to go into the details, but before they launched that plan, they spent a lot of time basically trying to convince people heat pumps can't heat your house in Colorado. So this was an interview that was done for the Denver Gazette. Let me just say the Denver Gazette is not a left-leaning newspaper. And this is what the Excel executive said. We do think heat pumps can deliver a significant amount of heating and emissions reduction in a reliable and affordable way when it's relatively mild outside, like the spring and the fall. We have to think about the most extreme conditions, though, when it's coldest out in the wintertime. Now, how many of you, when you heat your house, also want to heat it in the wintertime, not just the spring and fall? I'm betting most of you would prefer to heat your house even when it's cold outside. This is my house. It's all electric now. On the top is the heat pump, the outdoor unit on the upper left, the indoor unit on the right. I also have a heat pump water heater and induction stove, but that's not relevant to our discussion. But look at the top 2 photos. That's my heat pump. Worst weather I've seen so far in terms of temperature, January 15 to 16, two days in a row in 2023, outdoor temperature at minus 15 F. The heat pump kept my house at 70 degrees. If you look in the photograph on the upper left, that gray box on the wall is a disconnect switch. That's for my 10 kilowatt electric resistance backup heater. I have never switched that switch on. All right, so I've never used the backup electric resistance heat to heat my house. So Excel also wanted to mix hydrogen into the natural gas system. And it proposed to do this for a neighborhood in Hudson. Experts say blending hydrogen to gas pipelines won't work. Why? Hydrogen, it's the smallest molecule, right? The nucleus is 1 proton. Tiny molecule, it leaks like crazy. And I had some slides I was going to show you of examples at NREL where we actually faced hydrogen leakage problems. I decided, I got too many slides already. Believe me, it leaks. And when it leaks, it causes fatigue cracking. It gets into the little cracks and basically wreaks havoc. So the bottom line, Excel's maximum, they said they could go as high as 10% hydrogen mix, but because hydrogen only has 1/3 the energy per unit volume of natural gas, when you mix it in, a 10% mix only gives you 3% carbon dioxide reduction. And if you look at Excel's plans, they don't have any green hydrogen. They're going to use gray hydrogen and blue hydrogen, and I showed you how good blue hydrogen is. So this is a plot that I did where you actually looked. This is to get equivalent energy content when you put in mixtures. The x-axis is the percent hydrogen. The y-axis is the percent CO2 reduction. 10% blend, you get a 3%. 20% blend, you get a 7%. At these low mixtures, it's a pretty linear curve. It's curved, but it's almost a straight line at these low percentages. So that they might not even be able to go above 10% safely. And this talks about a recent paper in a Nature Scientific Reports journal. Hydrogen is leaking from a Dutch production and storage facility at 4.2%. So of all the hydrogen that gets used in that facility, 4.2% of it leaks. What's the problem with that? Hydrogen itself is not a greenhouse gas. It doesn't absorb outgoing infrared radiation. But what it does is it basically, it's the bottom equation there. It grabs onto these OH radicals to form water. And it's the OH radicals that break down methane in the atmosphere. And so what it does is it increases the lifetime of a very strong greenhouse gas, methane, in the atmosphere. And so equivalently, any hydrogen leaking has a global warming potential over a 20-year time frame, which I think is the time frame we should use. I mean, this is a crisis, right? Not 100 years from now. 33 times that of CO2. Methane is about 80 times. So it's not as bad as methane when it leaks, but it's a big effect compared to CO2. Okay, industry. And hopefully I'm wrapping up here in a few minutes. Industry, one of the things we have going for us, each one of these graphs shows the cumulative energy in an industry, and on the x-axis is at what temperature. And these all represent not different processes, but the actual different fuels used in different processes. It doesn't matter. The point is, if you look here, you can see between 35 or so and 85% of the heat is process heat is at temperatures below 200 degrees Celsius. Well, guess what? That's pretty much in the range of industrial heat pumps. So again, we got heat pumps working for us if we focus them on that low temperature range. And on the left side of this diagram, you can see the sources of heat and where they come from different processes. On the right side, you can see after the heat pump does the temperature lift, where it delivers the temperature to.
So they're all air-based heat pumps?
Not necessarily. Dry F, I think, makes air-to-air heat pumps, but I think they probably, I don't know if they make liquid-to-liquid also. There's a group called Energy Innovation, and you can actually get on their website and you can run this thing for different assumptions of policies. Their view of the future for industry is the yellow is electrification and the purple is hydrogen. Now, the thing is, when you get to high temperatures, you can't use heat pumps, but you can use electricity directly, and these are all the different ways you can use electricity. So, for example, electric arc heating, as we'll see in a minute, that's used to produce steel. But there's various other ways you can use electricity directly. Now, if you have a plant and you've invested millions of dollars into equipment that burns natural gas, you're probably not going to be happy pulling that equipment out and putting in equipment that uses electricity. So maybe in that case, you use electrolysis, you produce hydrogen, and you do that until you buy new equipment, in which case you electrify. Steel manufacture, basically, if you look on the right side of this diagram, that's where you have pure iron, and you run that into an electric arc furnace to produce steel. In the US, that's really about 70% of the steel produced is from recycled steel. So it basically doesn't have iron oxides in it. The left side of the diagram is where in many developing countries, you're starting with iron ore. You don't have this big supply of recycled steel. In that case, you got to get the oxygen out of the iron oxides, and you got to get pure iron, which then can go to an electric arc furnace. So, on the left side of this diagram, you see the way one of these furnaces, a blast furnace, uses today. Basically, you use coke, a form of coal, and at high temperature, basically what happens is in the iron oxide, the oxygen gets attracted to the carbon, and then you have CO2 emissions. And the idea here is you replace the coke with green hydrogen, and then the oxygen combines with the hydrogen, and you just have water vapor released. That's the concept, and there's actually a plant in Sweden that does that. Okay, well that's great, but now we've seen this new technology could kill the business case for hydrogen and green steel production. And I don't know if they're referring specifically to this process, but developed at MIT, a company called Boston Metal is actually looking at metal oxide electrolysis, using electricity to separate the oxygen out of the iron ore and get pure iron out of it. You know, how that, we have to see how that compares expense-wise. But you can see in this particular case, Germany is reviewing its green steel production plans. I think a lot of that has to do with just the availability of green hydrogen, and maybe could also have to do with this competition. All right, the last case is electricity storage. A lot of the NREL modeling shows at some point we're going to need seasonal storage, right? We're going to have basically excess wind and solar in the spring and fall, and we're going to need it in the summer for air conditioning. As we electrify buildings, we're going to need it for building heating in the wintertime. So moving from the swing seasons to the summer and the winter. And this is an IEA plot. And the x-axis on the bottom is discharge duration. And if you look at the right, that's seasonal, and you go up, you can see the only thing in terms of generation that gets you seasonal storage is hydrogen. And so a lot of people are saying, oh, we're going to need green hydrogen storage for seasonal storage. Now, in a country like the U.S., we span east-west 4 time zones. And so, you can move electricity all around the country. That can help. It's a question of how much we're going to need hydrogen storage. But if you do, the best place to store it is salt caverns. We actually have quite a few in the United States. We're blessed as far as that goes. But when you store hydrogen, you got problems with loss. On the left side are the ways hydrogen's a very active molecule. So it can get combined with other things and lost. And on the right side are the different ways hydrogen just leaks out. So again, you got this problem of containing something that is a strong but indirect greenhouse gas. All right, concluding remarks. Priority uses of hydrogen. So where does hydrogen make sense? So Michael Liebreich is an engineer who founded Bloomberg New Energy Finance. You ever hear of NEF, Bloomberg NEF? They publish lots of articles and stuff. He founded that, and he came up with his, and this is a very famous thing that's on the internet, his hydrogen ladder. And if you look at his hydrogen ladder, in this particular thing, the good uses are at the top, and the things that can be done other ways are at the bottom. All that stuff on the bottom, cars, trucks, all sorts of stuff, that yellow means electricity. We can do all that directly with electricity. The top row, and the green is biomass. The top row are the things that, well, we're probably going to need hydrogen for, and one of the big ones is fertilizer. For methanol, he's got biomass, but even there, you probably need some green hydrogen along with the biomass. You got hydrocracking and desulfurization. Those are in the petroleum refining industry. Again, a lot of that will go away. And so really, ammonia for fertilizer is probably the big thing that you need in terms of priority. And here's green ammonia production. You can see on the right side is the way it's normally produced, and on the left side is the green hydrogen electrolysis approach. So look, ultimately, if we want to decarbonize, we got to replace dirty, carbon-emitting ammonia fertilizer with green fertilizer. And this is really the way to do it, is to split water with electrolysis. And maybe methanol production too. But this raises another issue before we conclude. Okay, those are priority uses for green hydrogen. But to make green hydrogen, you need renewable electricity. So you got to ask yourself another question. Do I want to use the renewable electricity to produce green hydrogen, or are there better uses for that renewable electricity? Shouldn't we first reuse renewable electricity in the most effective ways to reduce CO2 emissions? And that's another chart that Michael Liebreich put together. Unfortunately, he reversed it in this case. In this case, the things that make sense are at the bottom, and the things that don't are at the top. So the x-axis here is tons of carbon dioxide abated by the process. And any of those purple bars are a hydrogen pathway, green hydrogen, and the blue bars are the electrification pathway, direct use of electricity. And what he's saying is, sure, the biggest bar that's purple, the two biggest bars are steel manufacturing, that's the lowest purple bar, and the next one above it is displacing gray ammonia with green ammonia. And those are pretty long bars, but they're not as long as the blue bars below. And what are the blue bars below? Displacing coal power generation. You got renewable electricity? Use it to shut down coal plants. Use it to feed heat pumps to heat homes. Use it to power battery electric vehicles. So here, the point is, yes, we can produce green hydrogen. There may be some good uses for it, but there are higher priority uses for that green electricity. Now, summary. Basically, gray and then blue hydrogen is being promoted by the industry. And many governments and taxpayer dollars are funding it. But it faces issues of low efficiency, high cost, lack of infrastructure, climate and air pollution impacts, and lots of misinformation. For most uses as a fuel, for example, ground transportation and building heating, the direct electrification is far superior. I mean, you can see those cascading efficiency diagrams. It's going to be needed for green ammonia, probably sustainable aviation fuels, maybe for producing steel from iron ore, but renewable electricity should first be used to displace fossil fuels. First thing we got to do is stop putting CO2 in the atmosphere by burning fossil fuels. There's a potential role for long duration storage, some high temperature process heat. I say short term because look, ultimately 100 years from now I would expect all industry to use electricity for everything. It may be expensive now to replace equipment that took a big capital investment, but if you're buying new equipment, it should be electric. And then long distance aviation and shipping. And I just wanted to say, I wanted to acknowledge people that have done a great job of informing people about all the pros and cons and issues with hydrogen, starting with Frank Reith and Ron West, Sandy Klein at the University of Wisconsin. He and I had some great discussions some years ago. Joe Rome, Michael Liebreich, and a whole bunch of others here. Before more information, you'll get these slides. You want to dig more into this, search the names of these people on the internet. They write blogs, they have articles, papers. You can learn a lot. Anyway, that's kind of a whirlwind tour of the hydrogen economy. So it's not dead, but it sure falls far short of maybe what people were expecting or promising.
Question about the DOE new program for renewable hydrogen. I should know the answer to this. Maybe I did at one point in time. But electrolyzers can you run those, turn those up and down, turn them off and on, like you would like to with renewables, or do you need storage?
Okay, good question. So if you look at the cost per kilogram of hydrogen from electrolysis, there's two costs. One is the cost of the electricity, right? The other is the capital cost of the electrolyzer equipment. And if you put the cost of the electrolyzer equipment into $1 per kilogram of hydrogen, right? that cost is a function of the capacity factor that the electrolyzer is run at. So if you have a narrow window of very high prices of electricity, and you say, oh great, I'm just going to run this electrolyzer when otherwise we curtail wind or solar. I'm going to have really cheap electricity. If you do that, and it's too short a period, you're running the electrolyzer at a low capacity factor, and its dollar per kilogram costs go up. So there's kind of a sweet spot in there. I actually had a diagram. I didn't include it here. IEA has a diagram that shows a pretty flat area. I'm not convinced it's that flat. But yes, I mean, that's the idea. And that's where the requirement in the IRA comes from, where they want you to be just running the electrolyzer while the renewable electricity is otherwise curtailed and available. Now, the other thing too, though, you have to realize when you have cheap electricity, other people are going to figure out uses for it. So one of the things we at CRES have been pushing is to get Excel. Excel now curtails solar throughout the year. The idea, what we're trying to push them to do is change time of use rates to incentivize daytime charging of electric vehicles. So that's another example where you can find other uses to use that otherwise curtailed electricity, not just electrolysis.
A quick note on the electrolyzers. I'm not sure how up-to-date this information is, but 2 years ago I talked to Dave Ginley at NREL, who is in one of the hydrogen-relevant departments, and he cautioned, that was actually at the ASES conference, that the lifespan of these electrolyzers is nowhere near it needs to be commercially interesting. And they just don't run as long, and they're very expensive to replace. So that's another caveat.
First of all, is your institute one of a very few that are blowing this whistle, so to speak? And number two, there's been a lot of studies done recently, including one by the American Society of Civil Engineers, the cities of the future that was shown at IMAX. And the guy that did that, Gerald Buckwalter, spent millions of dollars in all these studies, and he was wanted to feature hydrogen over electric for some reasons. And I'm wondering, if they're spending millions of dollars, why are they not getting this message?
Well, to be honest, I'm not sure how many of the researchers associated with RASEI are working directly on hydrogen. They tend to work, there's a lot of work on photovoltaics, various other technologies, wind, et cetera. I should know the answer to that question. I'm not sure how many people are working on hydrogen. Like I said, if they are, as I pointed out, there are some potential uses for hydrogen. It's not like there aren't any uses for it. I just think, do we need 7 hydrogen hubs around the country? I'm not convinced that we do. People are raising questions now. And again, I did want to point out that if you go back 20 years, you had Joe Rome, you had Frank Creeth, Ron West, and others, many others actually, I couldn't cover them all, that raised the red flag about this, that said, hey, hydrogen is not an energy source, it's a carrier, and it takes energy to produce it, and it's leaky, and it's easily combustible, et cetera. I think, though, that part of it is this all-of-the-above energy strategy. And if you look, you'll see the American Petroleum Institute has played a big role in promoting this all-of-the-above energy strategy. The fossil fuel industry has a lot of lobbying clout. And so I think they help propel a lot of this hydrogen research forward.
Thank you, Chuck, for a very informative presentation. Early on you talked about carbon sequestration, and then later you talked about storing the hydrogen in salt. And my concern is, how reliable are those storages? For the sequestration, there was in the mid-'80s a big carbon dioxide leak in Siberia from nowhere, and they haven't understood what, but it killed everything within 20 miles, farm animals and people, and they haven't been able to identify naturally occurring. So I'm wondering, because it is heavy it doesn't distribute real fast, and so it blankets. And so how reliable are these approaches of putting things in the earth?
Okay, so, carbon dioxide is a totally different thing.
I know.
I think you were talking about the Lake Nyos leak in Africa, and it was heavier than air, and so it was a blanket, and it moved, it hit a village about 15 miles away, killed most of the people in the village, if not all of them, and hundreds of livestock. It was a natural release of CO2 from that lake. Well, there was a leak in Mississippi. No one died from that. But, one of the things, if you get a leak like that, a real blanket like that, and you try to escape, and your car won't run. So it kind of suffocates everything. But that's CO2, and I think that's one of the many reasons why people should question CO2 sequestration. Hydrogen probably is a little bit more like natural gas. I mean, it's very light. It's not going to blanket the ground. It's not going to suffocate people. But it's very flammable, more flammable than natural gas, and very prone to leak. So, how much leakage and how much absorption of hydrogen would occur in salt caverns, we don't know. So that's an unknown. But it's certainly a question that would have to be answered.
Yeah, one of the factors for leakage is also that, for instance, if you were to run it in pipelines, the pressure in the pipelines differs all the time depending on how much is off-taken. And these are all stresses on the walls of the pipeline. And so embrittlement is one of the factors that play a role here. And they're really hard to control. Another factor you mentioned, Chuck, is burn off at sometimes or leakage rate. Both are not the same, but if you were to use
that was a leakage rate of like 4.3% or something, yeah.
Yeah, but the burn off is basically, it just disappears in your tanks. And for instance, if you were to run ocean-going ships, you would have to calculate for that continuing loss in your tanks and transport more of the hydrogen to run the ship's engines or fuel cells. Anyway, here's
He had his hand up for quite a while.
Questions.
Two questions. The first one kind of short. Early in your presentation, you said that the energy per mass of hydrogen was 3 times that of gas, and yet later on you said that the energy in hydrogen is 1/3 the energy in jet fuel. So I don't understand why jet fuel would be so much better than gas. Is that just...
So the first one referred to the density by mass, and the second referred to the density by volume.
Oh, okay. Okay, that explains that. Now, one last thing. I think you did use the word curtailment here recently, and so that I can think may be the only way, because hydrogen can be a way of storing energy. You electrolyze energy that would have been curtailed otherwise out in a wind farm, store it, and then use it for something else later on. That just would seem to be a free use, because that energy would not have been used anyhow, would have been shut down, right?
Well, it's not a free use, because you have to use electricity to produce the hydrogen. And you got to use it to compress it and transport it and store it, and you have this cascading thing.
But you'd be losing that in the curtailment. You're losing that capacity. You're just shutting it off, and you have the energy flowing through the wind turbine, but you're not using it to make energy.
Yeah, but the point is, you really have to compare using hydrogen to other means. You have to compare it to pumped hydro storage, to battery storage. Yeah, there's a company now making iron air batteries that has 4 days of storage. Now, it has a pretty poor round-trip efficiency, but hydrogen is so expensive and difficult to contain. It's a greenhouse gas. So that's why I think people don't look at hydrogen storage until you get to a place where you're looking at seasonal storage and you don't have any alternative.
So you're saying you're going to store the energy that would have been curtailed otherwise in batteries, right?
You want to as much as possible.
That makes sense.
Or, like I say, shift the loads. Find loads that you can use that for by, for example, instead of charging EVs at night, charge them during the day.
And as Chuck pointed out, there's a cascade of cost factors, and just the free electricity, if you can get it, is just one portion of that cost factor. All these other ones, they still apply, and those are not free.
Question on dirty ammonia. Did you produce and not provide a slide on cleaner creation of ammonia using hydrogen versus current techniques, because so much farming fertilizer is using dirty ammonia production? So question there. And then question about whether electrolysis via curtailed energy is even a reasonable short-term solution when you consider the rapid adoption of membership in the Southwest Power Pool and CAISO, and very shortly in the Colorado Electrical Transmission Authority. You know, if you look at PRPA, they went from 30% curtailment to 4% curtailment when they joined the SPP.
Yes.
So, I mean, I just wonder whether we're going to have an atmosphere of curtailment for much longer in the state.
Yeah.
But, you know, that's not really hydrogen specific. So specifically, can we make a dent in the greenhouse gas problem in terms of ammonia fertilizer using hydrogen?
Well, first of all, so I went through this quickly, but I had this diagram that shows green ammonia versus conventional ammonia, and it's basically using green hydrogen to produce the ammonia instead of gray hydrogen. So yes, we can produce green ammonia. It's going to be expensive. I mean, that's one of the things that's holding hydrogen up. Green hydrogen is expensive. I think you're right about curtailment. As we build more transmission, and as we allow electricity to move back and forth, LBL, Lawrence Berkeley Lab did a good study recently on the value of added transmission, particularly if you run transmission between the three major interconnects, the Western, the Eastern, and ERCOT. That has values of, 40, 50 cents a kilowatt hour if you can run those high voltage DC transmission lines. I think the NREL modeling shows that even when you have expanded transmission, when you get to really high percentages of renewables, like 95%, you reach a point where you're probably going to need some kind of seasonal storage. Now, there are people that debate that, and there are also people who say, well, if you can get to 95% and use the other 5% and you just burn natural gas, you have to look at what is how much carbon does that put in the atmosphere, and how many dollars per ton was some of the carbon dioxide removal methods cost. Could you reach a point where the CDR methods make sense, that you just don't worry about producing green hydrogen, you just burn natural gas? I don't know. We have to see when we get to that point. Yes.
Hey,
Joe.
that was fantastic. I encourage your slide deck to get out. I will personally get it to the Colorado Public Utility Commissioners. They need to see this for all the building electrification and things like that. Curtailment, I wrote lots of testimony at the state level. Be careful of what these utilities say. Cabin A came right back online when they became a partner in Weiss, but it is possible that SPP does enable curtailed and otherwise curtailed energy to actually be delivered. So just be careful about what they say, though. It was approaching $115 million that Xcel was spending per year on curtailing wind and solar that could otherwise be put into electric vehicles. If we have tens of thousands of these stored on, and that's the message I think you're trying to get to. You don't have to build new storage facilities and things like that. I do have a question. So were you going to comment on that?
Well, about the battery electric vehicles, Ron Sinton, who's part of our CRES policy committee, has done really fantastic work where he's sort of modeled the Xcel's grid and looked at the value. There's a fair amount of fossil fuel that's burned at night. And basically incentivizing electricity use at night only exacerbates that.
Yeah.
And the other thing, too, is that you might think, well, wait a minute, I'm at work during the day. It's easier to charge my electric vehicle at night. A couple things to keep in mind. One, the battery in an electric vehicle is not sized for daily use. It's sized for long trips. It's big. You only use a tiny percentage of it. post-COVID office workers these days, most of them are spending at least one day a week working at home as opposed to going in the office. So between a weekend day and a weekday, for the typical daily mileage, 40 miles a day that you might put in, you can charge during the day when the sun is out. And that's when I charge mine. I charge it on a sunny day. The other thing, too, is that, more workplaces are putting in charging stations. So I think switching, incentivizing daytime charging of EVs makes a lot of sense, and I think we'll see that. What was your other question?
Yeah, I do have a question. If you look at my testimony, the only one who's ever mentioned Ron Sinton, I included his data in my transportation electrification plan testimony.
Great.
V2G and dynamic pricing is a great strategy for getting that otherwise undelivered renewable energy into electric vehicles. That's the bottom line. It's actually getting picked up by commissioners now.
I mean, ultimately, as I point out, so my car, I have a Hyundai Ioniq 5. It has a 77 kilowatt hour battery. That's equivalent to 6 Tesla Powerwalls. When the grid is down, because I have vehicle to load, I plug in my house. And I can't run the 240 volt loads, but I can run virtually all the 120 volt loads in my house. I mean, if it was the dead winter day or something, I could plug a strip heater into the wall and run that. I can't run my heat pump. But what we're going to see is like the Ford F-150 Lightning, which can put out like 9.5 kilowatts. It can produce 240 volt output. That's going to become common. We're going to have all these battery electric vehicles, and I think we're going to take advantage of them. It's silly not to.
And to your point, hydrogen isn't as good as those things for certain things. You're a climate change professor and dedicated your life to that. Have you heard of McElmo Dome down south of Cortez? And did you know that they are Kinder Morgan pumps 1.2 billion cubic feet of carbon dioxide to Texas to be used for fracking purposes?
So, yeah, I mean, for enhanced oil recovery, I mean, that's pretty common. The guy who I'm sure knows all about that is Maury Wolfson, who keeps track of all those different projects.
Okay, that's what I just wanted to bring that up.
Yeah. I mean, that's really where captured CO2 has any economic value today is for enhanced oil recovery, which only makes the problem worse, of course.
Thanks, Chuck. How come Toyota and others have been so invested in?
I don't know.
Okay.
Yeah, nobody knows.
It's throwing good money after bad. It's sort of there's a name for that. No, I'll remember it. I'll remember it, and I'll tell you over the when we meet.
It also has to do with the Japanese custom of hierarchy and obedience to the leaders. It was once decided, and now they're going to go on with it. Chuck has the last word.
So yeah, it's called the sunk cost fallacy. The phenomenon whereby a person or company is reluctant to abandon a strategy or course of action because they have invested heavily in it, even when it is clear that abandonment would be more beneficial. So that's one possible explanation for why Toyota continues to pursue hydrogen fuel cell cars.
And on that happy note, I have some applause for our presenter.